Old Ken was already a very solid character in Super Turbo because he had the best DPs in the game, a good projectile, and a normal set very similar to old Ryu's, with much better priority crouching short, forward, and roundhouse. Old Ken retains those strengths in New Legacy, with a few tweaks here and there to his normals to make him similar to hyper fighting. Old Ken received many of the normal changes old Ryu received. That means higher far, strong, and fierce punch hitboxes, a smaller hurtbox on his far standing short, a bigger horizontal hitbox on his far standing forward, and a leg hurtbox on his diagonal jumping roundhouse, all from hyper fighting. It's worth noting that the jumping roundhouse change is actually a nerf, since in Super Turbo that normal beats any other air normal in the game, and can even beat characters' DPs if spaced correctly. Old Ken Shoryukens now deal 4 to 6 points less damage on their second active parts, similar to how they were in hyper fighting. Old Ken's strong and fierce Shoryukens now have better horizontal movement from hyper fighting. This improves their ability to hit both grounded and jumping characters from greater distances. Old Ken's strong Shoryuken is now a one-hit move, like it was in hyper fighting. Old Ken's fierce Shoryuken is now a two-hit move and has had its fire effects removed. Now it resembles hyper fighting both visually and in gameplay. Old Ken's Tatsumakis no longer hit on the way up like in hyper fighting. As compensation, they now have Ryu's hyper fighting invincibility on recovery. Because of this and their invulnerable startup, hyper fighting Ryu's Tatsus were very spammable. Old Ken's Tatsus aren't nearly as good, since they don't have hyper fighting Ryu's invulnerable startup or knockdown on hit. This encourages opponents to try to interrupt Old Ken while he's spinning. The recovery buff will be added in New Legacy's 0.8 update. Old Ken's aerial Tatsumakis now travel horizontally and have bigger hitboxes like in hyper fighting. This is actually somewhat of a loss for Old Ken, because unlike Ryu, he could combo into them from a diagonal jumping fierce, then combo into a sweep for a 3-hit combo. Old Ken's aerial Tatsumakis now have a minimal activation height, though it's lower than it was in hyper fighting. In Super Turbo, Old Ken could activate Tatsumakis right after jumping to travel very low to the ground. This looked very strange with the horizontal Tatsu, so now Old Ken has a minimal activation height to counteract that. Old Ken was already a very solid character in Super Turbo, and those strengths haven't been altered in New Legacy. With his completely invincible and fast recovering Shoryukens, his faster Hadoukens, and his improved normals from hyper fighting, including his better crouching short, forward, and roundhouse, Old Ken is still an effective zoning-oriented version of Ken.